My sister stole my inheritance for a luxury condo. The deed had a clause returning it to me. What she didn't know was that our grandfather had spent his last year planning the perfect trap for anyone who would dare to steal from family, and she walked right into it. Let me start at the beginning, in November 2021, when my grandfather, William Montgomery, passed away at 87. He built Montgomery Real Estate Holdings from nothing, starting with a single duplex in 1968 and growing it into a portfolio of 33 properties worth approximately $47 million. He was sharp until the very end, reviewing contracts and making business decisions just days before his death. I'm Nathan Montgomery, 34 years old, and I'd worked alongside Grandpa since graduating college. I started as a property manager, learning every aspect of the business from tenant relations to building maintenance to financial planning. My sister Victoria, 2 years older, had always been the family's golden child. Harvard MBA, married to a successful surgeon, living in a penthouse downtown. Victoria had visited Grandpa maybe twice a year, always arriving with expensive gifts and stories about her luxury lifestyle. She'd ask him for business advice she never took and promised to stay more involved in family matters. Then she'd disappear for months while I handled the actual work of helping Grandpa manage his properties. The will reading was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at the law offices of Morrison and Burke. Victoria flew in from Boston the night before, staying at the Ritz-Carlton and texting me photos of her suite's view. I picked her up that morning in my 10-year-old Honda, which she made a face at before climbing in. "Still driving this thing?" she said, checking her makeup in the visor mirror. "You know Grandpa left you a real estate empire, right? You can afford an upgrade." "We don't know what he left anyone yet," I said carefully. The conference room at Morrison and Burke was elegant and intimidating, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Arthur Morrison, Grandpa's attorney for 30 years, sat at the head of the table with several thick folders in front of him. "Thank you both for coming," Arthur began formally. William was very specific about how he wanted his estate distributed. I'll start by reading the relevant portions of his will. Victoria leaned forward, her designer bracelet clinking against the table. Arthur cleared his throat and began. "To my grandson Nathan, who has dedicated himself to learning this business and caring for these properties as if they were his own, I leave my personal residence at 847 Oakmont Drive, my collection of first edition books, and my 1967 Mustang convertible." I felt my stomach drop. The house was nice, worth maybe $800,000, and I loved the car, but compared to a $47 million real estate portfolio, this felt like being cut out entirely. Victoria tried to hide her smile, but couldn't quite manage it. Arthur continued. "To my granddaughter Victoria, I leave the entirety of Montgomery Real Estate Holdings, including all 33 properties, associated bank accounts, and business assets." Victoria actually gasped with delight. Oh my God, Grandpa, thank you." I sat there in shock, trying to process what had just happened. Everything I'd worked for, every property I'd helped maintain, every tenant relationship I'd built, all of it was going to Victoria, who couldn't tell you a single tenant's name. "However," Arthur said, and something in his tone made us both look up sharply, "there are conditions attached to Victoria's inheritance." "What kind of conditions?" Victoria asked, her smile fading slightly. Arthur pulled out another document. "Victoria must successfully manage the properties for a period of 2 years. This means maintaining occupancy rates above 85%, keeping all properties in good repair, and generating net operating income comparable to the previous 3-year average." "That's it." Victoria laughed with relief. "I have an MBA from Harvard. I can manage some rental properties." "Additionally," Arthur continued, looking directly at Victoria, "you must reside in one of the properties for the entire 2-year period. No renting it out, no leaving it vacant. You must live there personally." Victoria's expression changed. "Live in one of the properties?" "Arthur, most of them are in middle-class neighborhoods. I can't just move into some suburban duplex." "There is one exception," Arthur said, pulling out yet another document. "Property 33 is a luxury condominium at the Pinnacle downtown. It was acquired 6 months before William's death. You may live there." The Pinnacle was one of the most exclusive buildings in the city. Condos there started at $2.5 million. I'd never known Grandpa own one. Victoria's face lit up again. "The Pinnacle? That's perfect. I'll take that one." Arthur handed her a thick stack of papers. "These are the keys and all relevant documentation for the property. I should mention that William was very particular about the purchase of this unit. He paid cash and had several unusual clauses written into the deed." "What kind of clauses?" I asked, speaking for the first time. "Primarily related to fraud prevention. William was concerned about the legitimacy of certain financial transactions in his later years. The deed contains provisions that would void the ownership if the purchase money is ever determined to have been obtained through fraudulent means." Victoria barely glanced at the paperwork, too excited about her new luxury condo. "That's fine. Grandpa's money was all legitimate." Over the next 3 days, I watched Victoria move into the pinnacle with truckloads of designer furniture. She hired an interior designer, had a chef's kitchen installed, and threw a housewarming party for 50 people. Her Instagram was flooded with photos of marble countertops and city views. Meanwhile, I started the painful process of transitioning my role at Montgomery Real Estate Holdings. Victoria scheduled a meeting at her new condo to discuss the business going forward. I arrived to find her in expensive athleisure wear, drinking a green smoothie on her balcony. "Nathan, come see the view. Isn't it incredible?" "It's nice. Can we talk about the properties?" Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "I've hired a management company, Sterling Property Services. They'll handle everything." "Victoria, you can't just outsource this. The whole point of Grandpa's conditions was for you to manage the properties." "I am managing them. I'm managing the managers. That's what executives do, Nathan." Over the next 2 months, I watched Montgomery Real Estate Holdings begin to crumble. Sterling Property Services was expensive and impersonal, treating tenants like numbers instead of people. Long-term tenants who'd lived in our properties for years started receiving cold, corporate communications about rent increases and policy changes. Mrs. Patterson, who'd rented a duplex from us for 12 years, called me in tears. "They're raising my rent by $400 a month. I can't afford that on my pension. I thought your family cared about us." I called Victoria immediately. "You're displacing loyal tenants with these aggressive rent increases. This isn't how Grandpa ran things." "Grandpa ran things like a charity," Victoria shot back. "Sterling's recommendations are based on market rates. We were undercharging for years. We were building relationships and ensuring stability. That's worth more than squeezing every dollar out of people. You're too emotional about this, Nathan. It's business." By month 4, occupancy rates had dropped to 78%. 8 tenants had moved out rather than pay the increased rates, and Victoria hadn't approved any of the maintenance requests that were piling up. A broken water heater at the Riverside property had been waiting for approval for 3 weeks. I started documenting everything. Every tenant complaint, every maintenance delay, every decision Victoria made that violated Grandpa's management philosophy. I wasn't sure what I was building toward, but I knew something wasn't right. Then one afternoon, I received a call from Detective Lisa Brennan with the Financial Crimes Unit. "Mr. Montgomery, I'm calling about your grandfather's estate. We've been conducting an investigation into some irregularities with his accounts in the months before his death." My heart started pounding. "What kind of irregularities?" "Large transfers from his accounts to an offshore entity. We're trying to determine if these transfers were authorized or if someone had unauthorized access to his finances." "How much money are we talking about?" "Approximately $4.3 million over a 6-month period." I sat down heavily. "That's enough to buy the Pinnacle condo." "That's exactly what we thought," Detective Brennan said. "The purchase of that property was made with a cashier's check drawn on an account that received funds from these questionable transfers." My mind was racing. My grandfather had dementia symptoms in his last year. Mild but noticeable. He was forgetting appointments, repeating stories. Did anyone have power of attorney? My sister did. She pushed for it, claiming she needed it to help him manage his medical care since she was in Boston. There was a long pause. "Mr. Montgomery, I think we need to meet in person." Detective Brennan's office was downtown in a gray government building. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with a folder full of bank records spread across her desk. "Your grandfather was meticulous about his finances," she began. "Every transaction documented, every decision logged in his business journals. Then 6 months before his death, that pattern changed completely." She showed me the records. Starting in May 2021, large transfers began moving from Grandpa's main business account to a shell company in the Cayman Islands called VM Holdings LLC. The transfers totaled $4.3 million. "VM Holdings," I said slowly. "Victoria Montgomery Holdings." "That's what we think. The company was registered using your sister's law firm's address in Boston. We're working on getting the corporate records, but it takes time with offshore entities." "But why would Grandpa agree to this?" Detective Brennan pulled out another document. "We interviewed his doctor. Your grandfather was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's in January 2021. He was still mostly functional, but his judgment was compromised, especially regarding family matters. Victoria used the power of attorney to steal from him. That's what the evidence suggests. She systematically transferred money out of his accounts, funneled it through this shell company, then used it to purchase the Pinnacle condo. She probably planned to claim it was a gift from your grandfather." "But Grandpa knew," I said, suddenly understanding. "That's why he put those fraud clauses in the deed." Detective Brennan smiled grimly. "Your grandfather was sharper than she gave him credit for. Even with Alzheimer's, he knew something was wrong. Those deed clauses were his insurance policy." The investigation took 4 more months. During that time, Victoria's management of the properties continued to deteriorate. Occupancy dropped to 72%. 2 properties had serious maintenance issues that she refused to address. Sterling Property Services submitted a formal complaint about her unresponsiveness. I received regular updates from Detective Brennan as she built her case. Bank records, email trails, and testimony from Grandpa's accountant all painted the same picture. Victoria had systematically embezzled $4.3 million from a man with diminished capacity, using her power of attorney to authorize transactions he didn't understand. The breakthrough came when they obtained the VM Holdings records. Victoria had been the sole owner and had transferred the full $4.3 million to herself through a series of transactions designed to obscure the origin of the funds. Detective Brennan called me on a Friday evening. We have enough to file charges. Wire fraud, elder financial abuse, and theft. But before we do, you need to activate that deed clause. How do I do that? The deed specifies that if the purchase funds are determined to be fraudulent, ownership reverts to the named beneficiary. That's you, Nathan. Your grandfather named you as the reversionary beneficiary. Arthur Morrison walked me through the process. We filed a petition with the court, presenting Detective Brennan's evidence that the funds used to purchase the Pinnacle condo had been fraudulently obtained from Grandpa's accounts. Victoria's attorney tried to fight it, but the evidence was overwhelming. The judge reviewed the deed's fraud clause, examined the financial records, and made his ruling in less than 30 minutes. Based on the preponderance of evidence that the purchase funds were obtained through fraudulent transfers from William Montgomery's accounts and pursuant to the specific provisions in the deed dated May 15, 2021, I hereby order that ownership of the property at the Pinnacle, Unit 4702, shall revert to Nathan Montgomery, effective immediately. Victoria's scream echoed through the courtroom. This is insane. That's my home. You can't just take it. The judge looked at her coldly. Ms. Montgomery, you may want to consult with your attorney about the criminal charges being filed against you for elder financial abuse. I'll never forget the look on Victoria's face as the reality crashed down on her. Everything she'd taken, every luxury she'd bought with stolen money, was disappearing. The next week was chaotic. Victoria was arrested and released on bail. Her husband filed for divorce within 48 hours. The luxury condo at the Pinnacle, which she'd spent $300,000 renovating, now belonged to me. I met with Arthur Morrison to discuss what came next. Your grandfather was brilliant, Arthur said, shaking his head in admiration. He knew Victoria had stolen from him, but he couldn't prove it while he was alive. So he built this trap into his will. The whole inheritance was a test. Exactly. He gave her everything, knowing that if she'd stolen the money, the investigation would eventually prove it. And when it did, the condo would revert to you as specified in the deed. What about the rest of the properties? Arthur pulled out yet another document. There's a secondary clause in the will. If Victoria fails to meet the conditions of her inheritance, which includes maintaining the properties properly, everything reverts to you after 2 years. I looked at the occupancy records and maintenance logs. Victoria had violated virtually every condition. She's already failed. Occupancy is below 85%, maintenance is deferred, and net operating income is down 32%. Which means at the 2-year mark, you'll inherit the entire portfolio. Victoria's criminal trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of her systematic theft from Grandpa. The defense tried to argue that Grandpa had gifted her the money, but his business journals told a different story. In one entry from June 2021, Grandpa had written, "Victoria came by today, asking about money. I don't remember what I told her. Need to talk to Arthur about protecting Nathan." That entry, along with dozens of others, showed that Grandpa knew his memory was failing and was trying to protect his assets from exploitation. The jury found Victoria guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution of $4.3 million, which she obviously couldn't afford. Her fancy Boston life evaporated. The penthouse she'd owned there had to be sold to pay legal fees. Her Mercedes was repossessed. Everything she'd built on stolen money crumbled. 2 years after Grandpa's death, I inherited the full Montgomery Real Estate Holdings portfolio, exactly as he'd planned. I immediately began repairing the damage Victoria had caused. I fired Sterling Property Services and brought property management back in-house. I called every tenant who'd left and offered them their units back at the old rates. Mrs. Patterson cried when I told her she could return to her duplex. "Your grandfather was a good man," she said. "I knew his granddaughter wasn't like him." I spent $400,000 on deferred maintenance, fixing everything Victoria had neglected. I hired back the staff she'd fired. Slowly, the properties returned to the condition Grandpa would have expected. The Pinnacle condo presented a unique decision. I could have lived there, but it didn't feel right. That luxury tower wasn't me, and it had been purchased with stolen money. Instead, I sold it for $3.2 million and used the proceeds to establish the William Montgomery Foundation, providing affordable housing assistance to elderly tenants in our properties. It felt like the right way to honor Grandpa's memory. Today, for years after Grandpa's death, Montgomery Real Estate Holdings is thriving. We own 38 properties now, having added 5 more using profits from proper management. Occupancy is at 94%, and we have a waiting list for most units. I still drive that 10-year-old Honda, though I could easily afford something nicer. I still live in Grandpa's house at 847 Oakmont Drive, surrounded by his books and his memory. Victoria was released from prison last year after serving 3 years. She works as a paralegal now, making $45,000 a year and living in a studio apartment. We haven't spoken since the trial. Sometimes I think about how differently things could have gone if Grandpa hadn't been sharp enough to recognize Victoria's theft despite his Alzheimer's. If he hadn't worked with Arthur to build those deed clauses. If he hadn't kept meticulous records, even as his memory failed. But Grandpa understood people. He knew Victoria's character, knew her priorities, and knew she'd eventually reveal herself. He just needed to create the conditions that would expose the truth. The inheritance wasn't really about the money or the properties. It was about proving who could be trusted with his legacy. Victoria failed that test spectacularly, and in doing so, proved exactly why she should never have been trusted with anything in the first place. I keep one of Grandpa's journal entries framed in my office. It's from July 2021, 2 months before he died. If you're reading this, Nathan, it means everything worked out. I know Victoria took from me. I can't prove it, but I know. I built safeguards into everything because I wanted you to have what you earned. You were always the right choice. You just needed time to prove it. Trust the process. Trust Arthur. Trust yourself. Love, Grandpa. That note reminds me that even when things seem unfair, even when it looks like the wrong person is winning, patience and integrity eventually win out. Grandpa's plan took years to fully execute, but it worked perfectly. The luxury condo was just bait in the trap. The real inheritance was the lesson about character, patience, and the importance of building things that last longer than we do. Victoria wanted the quick win, the impressive address, the Instagram-worthy lifestyle. She got it briefly, and then lost everything because it was built on fraud. I got the slower path, the harder work, and the satisfaction of building something legitimate that helps people. That's the inheritance Grandpa really wanted me to have. Thanks for following this whole complicated story. Justice isn't always fast, but sometimes it's incredibly thorough when you plan it right. Until we meet again, folks. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your thoughts.